your discussion on the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas, repercussions on world peace. The participants are Shilkant Sharma, former diplomat, and Professor Swaran Singh from Jawaharlal Nehru University. The moderator is Manas Pratim Bhuyan, journalist.
Discussion on the current situation that has arisen out of the conflict between Israel and Hamas militants. So there has been growing global concerns over the situation arising out of the Hamas-Israel conflict as Israeli forces continue to retaliate for the unprecedented cross-border attacks on Saturday by Hamas. At least 1,300 Israelis have been killed in the attacks by Hamas, while number of people in Palestinian side killed in Israeli offensive is more than, again, 1,300, and there is no sign of any end to the hostilities so far. So India on Thursday described the strikes by Hamas on Israel as terror attacks, but at the same time reiterated its long-standing position advocating the resumption of direct negotiation towards establishing a sovereign, independent, and a viable state of Palestine living within secure and recognized borders side by side at peace with Israel. So, Ambassador Sharma, I would like to know your views first on the overall situation as well as India's reaction to it.
The overall situation is very frightening because the level and intensity and the brutality of violence which has been unleashed in the beginning is unprecedented. It's difficult to compare it. And naturally, when you have civilians like music festival going on, and then they are attacked and more than 1,000 people get killed and held hostage. So it shocks the country which has been subject to this. So the retaliation is taking place. And everyone is saying it is a terrorist incident because when you attack civilians for pursuit of your own aims and you mercilessly kill indiscriminately innocent people, it is terrorism. So you cannot justify. India's position is that terrorism cannot be justified on any ground whatsoever. This is the position. Right. Actually, we have condemned it. Now, as regards the question of Palestine, India has a long-standing position that India stands for a state of Palestine adjoining Israel, and that both of them to live in peace and security, as you have narrated the official statement. That statement covers all the points. The need to live in peace and security, need to have a state in that area. So we are still for it. And then to have a negotiated process. So India is not for violence. This has been so for the last 40 years. India has never been in favor of violence to achieve these aims. So naturally, violence is not to be accepted. Now, both sides at the moment to the conflict are expressing great anger. The Hamas is sworn to bring Israel to naught. And Israel is utterly shocked by this attack. So Israeli leadership is now, they have to take very stiff, very strong and immediate action. And that action is actually showing up because they have now started bombing the areas in Gaza. And the other very diabolical dimension of terrorism is that those who perpetrate this hide in the civilian structure. So there are this kind of a situation where you have a double hostage taking. First, they take hostage of the people who gave them shelter. And then secondly, they try to take hostages of the adversary. And both these to serve their own aims. This is the problem with terrorism. Then when they try to attack, then they say innocents are killed and there are collateral damage and the indiscriminate attack. But intelligence failures lead to this. And if you go to the genesis of this whole conflict, you'll find that it is not now, but in the past also, there's always been a certain surreptitious way of moving and then springing a surprise with a violent action, which is unprecedented. That's why even Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, said, this is our 9/11. So, people draw immediately comparisons. Now, we are not involved in this thing. We are seeing it from a distance, but our people are involved. So, a government of India has first taken a position condemning terrorism. Second, they want peaceful settlement, negotiations. And third, we will want our people to come back. So one flight has already come, 211 Indians who were trapped there have been brought back. So this is our bounden duty. This is what our government has said, that their first priority to save Indians anywhere and to bring them back. So that the government has done. And for that to take place, they are in touch with the stakeholders. This is what has been stated. Now, stakeholders are, always in the Middle East, it is not a new problem. It is a festering sore for last 70 years. So many countries are involved. They have their views. But over the years, in recent times, a certain attitude has become strong that peace is the way, and then they should live together peacefully and not look for war. So just a week back, as the US Secretary of State said, the situation in the Middle East is the best ever. So this is the thing, that when things look good, that's the worst time. This is the kind of situation we are now in. When it was looking all normal, suddenly it explodes into such a violent way. And the thing is that it is the audacity of violence which strikes you. And so immediate concern is naturally humanitarian. And nobody wants to see these very terrible images on the TV screen. So everyone wants the things to stop. But those who are affected, they have their own line. So one has to find ways to reach them and persuade them to come to some kind of a modus vivendi and look for peace. The other problem is that Hamas is a non-state actor. But over the last 16 years, since 2006, it has been controlling Gaza after having won the elections there. But it is the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah which has the recognition. So how do you deal with a non-state actor? This is also a problem. Of course, they have a certain cause, and they have pushed the situation to a point where, like the diplomatic moves which were underway between Saudi Arabia and Israel and between Gulf states and Israel, suddenly those diplomatic moves are now in a bit of a jeopardy because of the sudden spurt of violence. And because on the Arab street, there is still sympathy for Palestinians. But the thing is that the extremist elements, they should not hog the space which is meant for the victims. Palestinians have been victims, but their place is now taken up by the extremists. And this is where the problem is. How to deal with that? They have to find some way to reach to all the people concerned. I understand that Turkey is trying to do some mediation. I understand humanitarian assistance. Egypt is opening up and they are trying to let flights come to their side of Gaza. And other countries are also showing concern. But important thing is that they should not fish in troubled waters. I'm not saying anything against Egypt or Turkey, but any other country which tries to find this situation in a way that it can, use it expediently, this is not fair. So such situation should be avoided and tension should be brought down. That seems to be at the moment the overall observation that I have. But, in the course of the discussion, we can get to more.
Yeah, Professor Singh, definitely, in fact, as articulated by Ambassador Sharma, there has been widespread condemnation of Hamas's attacks on Israeli cities. But at the same time, there has been mounting concerns over the kind of offensive Israel is carrying out in Gaza or planning to carry out in Gaza. And even US President Joe Biden asked Tel Aviv to operate by the rules of the war. So in view of the escalating situation, India also yesterday said that there is an universal obligation to observe international humanitarian law. And there is also a global responsibility to fight the menace of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. So how do you see the nuanced position articulated by India?
Thank you, Manas. First of all, let me underline that it's a very complex conflict. Different countries have different views on the subject. But there are things that are clear on which there is no confusion. First of all, for example, this is not being called as Arab-Israeli war or Arab-Israeli conflict. It's not even called as Israeli-Palestinian war or conflict. Very clearly, it is being described as Israeli and Hamas conflict or war, whatever word you wish to use, which makes it very clear this is a conflict between, as Ambassador Sharma said, non-state entity called Hamas and Israeli state. That in some sense is a good sign, because if that clarity sustains itself, then conflict is not likely to become larger, involving other players and other actors, at least not directly. The only country which seems to be most visibly getting involved is United States, which has sent Secretary of State first, followed immediately by Defense Secretary, and clearly providing all sorts of equipment and help to Israeli forces. Second element, I think, which is very clear, is the growing understanding around the world, despite all the differences that countries have on the subject, that any such violence on innocents, to the extent that now voices are saying that even in retaliation, attacks on innocent civilians are not acceptable, and that there are rules and norms of how war has to be conducted. And these voices are catching certain amount of strength in view of how Israel is building up in southern Israel, facing north of Gaza, asking people to vacate north of Gaza, which United States is saying is not an easy possibility. But more complicating is that Hamas is saying that such diktat is not acceptable. And they have already announced that about 13 of the hostages that they have killed during Israeli strikes, and that they are not willing to move out of North Gaza. And Israelis are saying that they want to virtually flatten North Gaza buildings and then move in physically to forever eliminate the threat from Hamas. And here I think what is most important to understand is how India's position is involved. India is a very strong friend and partner of Israel. Particularly from 1990s onwards, we have developed a very strong relationship. Israel is the third largest supplier of India's defense imports. Israel is seventh largest trade partner of India. And particularly in critical technologies, in innovation, as we say, defense, diamonds, and water dripping technique is how India has built very close relationship with Israel. And of course, between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Prime Minister Modi, there is a personal bonhomie as well. And so in that sense, if Israel gets kind of engaged in such a dangerous, violent and prolonged conflict or war, it would really impact India, even if it doesn't impact the global situation as much as Ukraine war, for example, has done. And second, because there's a clear identification of Hamas. Indian Prime Minister has described Hamas as a terrorist grouping, just like many other leaders have described them as terrorist grouping. India has always tried to raise its voice against terrorism around the world. From mid-1990s, India has been negotiating an international convention to counter terrorism at the United Nations. And India wants to really underline that, how at the global level, terrorism is not understood as a shared common threat for all, and strategies are not built to deal with it. Then, of course, these kind of dangerous, violent outbursts, killing thousands of innocent people, are likely to be repeated again and again. So in that sense, India not only has interest and engagement with what is happening on the ground there in terms of 18,000 Indians. Operation Ajay has already been kicked in, and India is known for protecting its citizens in conflict zones. Ukraine had seen 24,000 Indians being brought home by India. That is one level of exercise. Cooperation, partnerships with Israel is another level of engagement that India has with what happens there on the ground. And of course, the whole issue of terrorism that India has been also raising in several forums around the world is again. So at multiple levels, in multiple ways, India gets more engaged sort of in what happens on the ground between Hamas and Israel than maybe, several other countries may be. But I think one is also noticing restraint by some of the other countries. For example, Iran has tried to distance itself, even if it has given a sort of principle support in principle that West Palestinian rights must be considered. They're not so much openly supporting Hamas in this case. Hezbollah also has kind of distanced by saying that their strikes that happened initially on last Sunday were not in support of Hamas, but for their own reasons. So in that sense, I think the voices of restraint are becoming much more visible now, whether it is Indian Prime Minister or President Joe Biden of United States. And of course, the regional major national leaders are also saying the same thing, because, the fear is that Israel could also reciprocate and respond in a very, very sort of destructive fashion. And that is my last point for this initial intervention, because Israel has not just suffered a historic, unprecedented attack leading to 1,300 plus and more counting deaths inside Israel, but I think it's also an enormous hit on Israel's credibility, Israel's sort of capability. And Israel is known to be very capable in protecting its citizens. And that image of Israel around the world of being very alert country, very advanced technologically, very capable of defending and protecting its citizens. And last very quick point, I think just 10 seconds, we are also realizing that those who are held hostage by Hamas are not just Israeli citizens. There are Germans there are Americans there, are nationals of other countries there. So I think in that sense, it has potential to explode in a very dangerous fashion. And therefore, that is leading most stakeholders around the world to begin to now talk of need for Israel as it goes out and then decides to respond to this unprecedented attack.
Ambassador Sharma, India has been in touch with various key stakeholders over the crisis, even as its primary focus has been on safety and well-being of around 18,000 Indians living in Israel. India has good relations with Israel, Palestine, and almost all major players in West Asia, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and United Arab Emirates. And New Delhi is also having good relations with leading international players like European Union and the United States of America. So considering India's good relations with all the key stakeholders, do you think India is well placed to play a role in diffusing the current crisis?
I think the appeal has already been made for peace and for calm. And that appeal has to be resounding by similar appeals from all the stakeholders. And which is also, as you announced in the beginning itself, is happening. So this voice of reason and moderation has to gain ground and has to strengthen itself. And India certainly lends its strength to this voice of moderation and reason. Diffusion of the crisis is very difficult in this particular situation, as you would recall in similar situations elsewhere in the past also, because once violence erupts, it leads to its own very destructive autonomy. Then the parties involved, they generally don't listen to what others are saying, because they have a certain limited aim to accomplish, without which they have as Professor Swaran Singh said about credibility, etc. The whole standing is at stake at this moment. And then if you hold hostage, it is most terrifying. And if you see the record of Israel, it has never allowed hostage taking. Way back in 76, when I used to be in the Middle East, there was this Antabe incident in which the Israeli airline was hijacked. And Mr. Netanyahu's brother was killed in that action which Israel took when they released the hostages and they just stormed them. So it is not now. For 50 years, they have been very clear what to do about how to deal with terror. And so if you were to expect that Israel will say, okay, they won't attack, and these things are very difficult. They will not work at this juncture. We have to work very gently, very slowly, and all parties have to reach. And Hamas, having initiated this whole cycle of downward violence, it's diabolical. They have to come to some kind of a understanding and, come to some kind of a sense that this is not the way. They cannot accomplish anything like this by this. They will only make a very violent statement, as was made by, say, 9/11. But it doesn't lead to anything, and nobody believes in that because the reason is not there. So I think at this juncture, it is a bit, to my mind, I'm speaking personally, it's a bit unrealistic to expect a certain holding up or tempering or stopping of the action-reaction process. This is going to go for a while. But in the meanwhile, attempts should be made to reach out to both parties and somehow the other achieve some kind of calm. Like what was done in the 73 war. Henry Kissinger was the Secretary of State, and within days he was trying to reach out to Moscow. At that time it was Cold War, and they were trying to work out some way to stop the thing, and of course playing their own politics, this and that. But it took a few days, and then finally a ceasefire was agreed. And at that time they were fully developed states like Egypt and Syria who were involved, and they took action. So when states are involved, it's easier to negotiate, easier to talk. When there is a non-state actor, one never knows who to talk to, who to reach. So all these are then a kind of a back channel and subsurface contacts. And in that process, There are all kinds of formalisms also, like a state like Israel would not like to deal with Hamas because they don't consider Hamas as an entity which should be given any quarter. Israel has been dealing with the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, but Hamas, they have not openly given any credence. So then how do you come to some kind of a understanding or modus vivendi in this process? It's a real, at the moment, the situation is really very dangerous, and all our wishes are necessary and they should be strengthened and they should move in the right direction. But to expect quick relief, I think, is unrealistic.
Manas, if I can add just on the optimistic side of looking at if there are possibilities of early control of the situation, we are hearing in reports that about 67 of the Hamas fighters have been neutralized by Israel, but also or 36 of them, including the deputy commander of Hamas, have been captured. So Israel also has now Hamas fighters in their possession. And one is also hearing reports of protests in Tel Aviv of the family members of people who are held hostage by Hamas in Gaza, saying that perhaps there should be possibility of swapping hostage by both sides. I'm not saying that Israel is going to change its sustained policy of not negotiating with terrorism, but this is also, remember, unusually televised war. From India itself, I think more than half a dozen reporters are on the ground there. And imagine likewise around the world, other television cameras are all over. I'm hearing the kind of pictures on the screen in United Nations showcasing faces of people who are held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. So that kind of visibility of the pain that people have on the ground, indeed on both sides, could perhaps have its own influence. Not to say that Israel is going to change its policy and negotiate with Hamas, but there is a kind of opening that one can think how they will respond to these voices, both inside Israel and around the world now, asking Israel to show restraint. One is not sure, but one can be perhaps optimistic to say maybe there is going to be some innovative way of fundamentally controlling the violence. I think that is something on which the whole world probably is agreeing today, that one doesn't know how, but there is urgent need to control, de-escalate, rather than allow this violence to escalate uncontrollably, because that could be really dangerous, because it is a very complex and complicated conflict, and its history involves so many other players and stakeholders in the region, all the way from Russia to United States and others. And therefore, the consensus is need to control it early. And that is where I'm saying the fact that this is extremely televised war and the whole world is watching it real time could have its own influence as to how Israel tackles this challenge that it has from Hamas.
Professor Singh, Israel-Palestinian peace efforts have been stalled since 2014 when talks failed between Israelis and Palestinians in Washington. So do you think that current crisis is a result of the failure of the relevant international community to revive the peace efforts since 2014? Do you think time has now come to restart the peace process to arrive at a mutually acceptable solution to the Palestinian issue?
Manas, I will again be very cautious in not looking at it as a larger regional conflict where international community has not been able to deliver. I want to still look at it as a conflict between Hamas and Israel. In fact, IDF, Israel Defense Forces, and Hamas is where the conflict is. Otherwise, at the regional level, one can notice several positive initiatives. For example, with Qatar, China was able to bring certain kind of a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was soon going to build another rapprochement with Israel now. Under Abraham Accords, for example, Israel was being gradually accommodated, recognized, and sort of seen as part and parcel of the region. And in fact, many people believe now that perhaps Hamas did not want that kind of transformation happening where Israel becomes acceptable to the major powers in the Middle East region. And therefore, I don't think international community was found missing or ignoring the complicated problem on the ground. In fact, international community was trying to bring more stability and mutual engagement. In fact, you remember 2021, September, I2U2 initiative of another Quad was initiated where Israel, Qatar, United States and India were sitting together. And so I assume international community was not completely absent, except that I think that at the core the problem was between Hamas and Hamas. In fact, often critics of Hamas have called the Palestinian Authority as agents of Israel. So I don't know if Palestinian Authority was to negotiate with Israelis, Hamas is going to listen to them. I think it's a very complicated thing, but let's say limited to IDF of Israel and Hamas on the other side, whereas other stakeholders over a period of time have sort of built, not very effective, but a certain kind of rapprochement. And that bigger, larger regional atmosphere actually should help us ensure that this does not escalate uncontrollably, and there is a possibility of finding some way of de-escalating this conflict sooner than later.
Ambassador, my last question. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called up our Prime Minister and apprised him about the situation. The telephonic conversation took place on Tuesday. And our Prime Minister conveyed to the Israeli PM that people of India stand firmly with the country in this difficult hour and express strong and very unequivocal condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. So how do you see PM Netanyahu's gesture of calling up our Prime Minister and apprising him about the situation?
Well, this is something which India's position has always, we have a consistent positions against terrorism. And we have, for the last at least 30, 40 years, have never minced our words in condemning acts of terrorism anywhere. So this is a clear act of terrorism. So India and Prime Minister has supported Prime Minister Netanyahu and said that India stands with Israel in this hour of, it's a very difficult situation for Israel. The state of Israel, the way it has evolved, the whole history of the region, you will realize the actions which Israel takes and why it takes. On the other hand, Hamas, and we have followed Middle East for 50 years, we find when PLO was going strong, within PLO umbrella, there were PFLP, there were Al-Fatah, there were other organizations which used to say, oh, he's going to compromise. So there is this element always present where a certain fringe or certain faction is opposed to any peace deal and chides that as a kind of sellout. So Hamas has been, master at that. They have not accepted any deal so far, any attempt at peace building. They work beneath the surface. Whatever they have accepted, maybe they have accepted in private talks with Qatar or with Turkey or with Egypt or whichever country. But openly they don't accept. So one doesn't know what they want. So if one doesn't know what they want, how can you start a process? So that's why there is a certain need for gentle persuasion from outsiders who have a strong stake there to both parties, and particularly I would say Hamas, not to escalate this situation. And international citizens who are there in Israel, you take them hold hostage. This is old terrorism, and nobody accepts this now. So, and naturally India has supported. But the position about Palestine, I would say Hamas has actually sprung itself away from what Palestine requires. The authority in Ramallah and the moderates in Palestine, they want to do a deal. They want to live in peace. And they are a people who are intelligent, educated, skilled, and they want to make use of the opportunity to build. But look what Hamas has done to Gaza. It has turned it into a garrison strip, underground arrangements and logistics and military and missiles. Now, naturally, this will evoke a war-like response from any neighbor for that matter. And we have seen this. We have seen this in the past. When PLO used to do this in Lebanon, PLO was attacked strongly by Syria, for instance, in 1976 during the Civil War. So we have seen the history of Middle East that any faction, any group which tries to take things in its hands and wants to do violence is not acceptable to the others.
Yeah, Ambassador Sharma and Professor Singh, thank you so very much for your detailed perspective on the current crisis that has arisen out of Hamas's unprecedented attacks on Israeli cities, and then that has been repulsed also by Israel. So thank you so very much.
You were listening to a discussion on the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas, repercussions on world peace. The participants were Shilkant Sharma, former diplomat, and Professor Swaran Singh from Jawaharlal Nehru University. The moderator was Manas Pratim Bhuyan, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani.
This is Akashvani.